and everything.
Break? I mean, is there a break after I do this?
Yeah, so there's today's schedule. Yeah, you don't have to do it 100% like that. I was just trying to give us like an hour and a half for lunch in case people want to go out to a restaurant. Maybe we can even do something as a group with people here. Yeah. All right, good morning. Let's go ahead and get started today. Glad that all of you are here. I know we were discussing it being a small group, but I think we are a small but mighty group. So glad that you all made the choice to be here, and who knows who we may see throughout the day as well. We're excited to have Mark here. He's going to be here today and tomorrow. As you can see today's schedule there, we've got 3 different topics that he's going to go over. So I've known Mark for a few years now, and last couple years I've gotten to know him even better and really appreciate Mark and his ministry and his friendship. Over the years, Mark has been actively involved in grief counseling, leading grief support groups, and helping people cope better with grief and bereavement in the Ohio Valley. Mark was born and raised in Fremont, West Virginia. He has been preaching since 1994 in churches in West Virginia, Kentucky, and Ohio. Mark has taught as an adjunct instructor for Ohio Valley University from 2008 to 2021, and he worked with Ohio Valley Christian Youth Camp and West Virginia Christian Youth Camp. Mark graduated from OVU with an associate and a Bachelor of Science degree in Bible in 1997. He then attended the Harding Graduate School in Memphis, Tennessee, and later Kentucky Christian University in Grayson, Kentucky, where he graduated with a Master of Arts in Christian Leadership in 2004. Mark is married to the former Laura Keplinger. Is that how you say it? Okay. And you're from Columbus, Ohio, so glad to have you here with us today. She is an office assistant at Genesis Hospital in Zanesville, Ohio, and Mark and Laura have 2 married daughters, Brianna and Samantha. Mark enjoys fishing, gardening, and any time he can spend with his wife and daughters. So we're all going to go fishing with Mark after this and have a good time. But no, I'm excited for these topics. I think we'll benefit from them, whether or not we are currently dealing with grief or whether or not we are maybe helping others who are grieving as well. I know that many of us find those in those various situations, and so we're looking forward to what we can learn from this and what Mark can share with us. So I'll go ahead and turn things over to Mark.
Thank you, Ben. You got the extras. Oh, there you go. Need one. I want to put these back here in case somebody else comes. And that way. Well, very good morning. Appreciate you being here. Appreciate the opportunity to be here. And it's thank you for Ben for the introduction. And yeah, Ben and I have known each other for a few years. And this is the first time I've been to Mount Vernon. And so it's a beautiful city. And appreciate to get to see Ben. We've had Ben down at Norville Park, I think, at least once. And so glad that, I guess, trade back and forth here. So we're going to begin talking about the grief process. And if I can get all this working. All right, I'm going to put a slide up here to get us started. Now, you might think and smile about this, but they all have something in common. Batman, Superman, Spider-Man. Really, if you investigate it, a lot of the comic book heroes have something in common. Also something common with the movie Up. I don't know if you've seen this, one of my favorite animated movies. And then maybe telling a little bit of my age, maybe, but Monk, it was a TV show, private investigator, and they all have something in common: grief. Each one of these characters, even though they're imaginary, has at the beginning dealing with a loss of loved one. Of course, Batman lost his parents, Spider-Man his uncle, Carl in the movie Up, his wife. And there's some other grief that is mentioned there as well. Superman, the whole story there, family, planet, everything. And then Monk, the one murder he could not solve was his wife. And I think they updated that with a new movie here not too long ago. But I want us to introduce us to think about that grief plays a part in our everyday life. Grief is something that people have used in Hollywood to make movies. And I would say that the list is even greater when you think about some of the shows that are out there. There's a lot of grief. And so it's something we deal with each and every day. I want us to look at that, how that impacts our life. We don't talk a lot about it. It's interesting. We do have this that's out there. So we're aware of grief. But it's one of those things, and I've included this in I think the back of the handout I gave you, the elephant in the room. And I'll let you read that little poem, but I think it's very appropriate for what we're doing today. As much as we want to talk about it, we don't talk about it. And so today we're going to try to talk about it and think about what is involved with grief. Now, one of the things when you think about grief is ultimately the loss of a loved one. That's the first thing that comes to mind. But grief is really an umbrella of any type of a loss. So when you think about grief and what's involved, it's not just the loss of a loved one. That's probably one of the very paramount things we think of. Any type of death, grief can ensue. Sometimes it's not even talked about as a miscarriage. That's a great grief. It's probably one of the, and I'm going to summarize this with saying that's one of the least talked about griefs. We kind of ignore that, but it's very, very, very much grief, a lot of heartache there. But anytime there's a death resulting in any, from an accident, sickness, suicide, and really we could talk about all of these in lessons in themselves, but time won't allow us, and this is just giving an overview. So when we think about grief, that is the one thing we think about. Come on in, and welcome. We're just beginning, and Ben's going to get you a handout here. Grief is also separation. When you think about what grief is involved with, it's separation, leaving home for any reason. Maybe you left for college. You ever get homesick? Well, that's a form of grief, separation. Empty nest, that's where my wife and I are right now. Our children have went to college, they married, and one's living in Arkansas, one's living in Tennessee. So we have distance separating us as well, that place in life. And so empty nest, when you talk about empty nest, it's a form of grief. There's a separation there. Anytime couples separate, whether it's for a job or military, or there's marital problems, and they separate. Divorce is a form of what people experience grief. One individual put it this way, divorce, they described it as the worst type of grief, because when you think about a person that dies, there's a type of grief there. But as this person explained it, the divorce situation, you still see the person, and that adds to that grief. So separation, wars, tragedies, jobs, types of things. Learning one has a disability, one or a serious illness. There's a certain grief that's there. You've lost something, or you're about to lose something, eyesight, a limb, a job. These types of things, a house, a fire. I was conducting some of this one time, some of these lessons, and an individual came up and said, well, so-and-so lost a house, but over here they had a break-in. And they were discussing who had it worse. And I don't know if that is a competition, okay? Loss is loss, and my loss and your loss might be different, but we still feel a loss. And so this is not to be competitive. It's not to be, the woe is me club that I have more woe than you do. Because we all have loss. The death of a pet. This is real stuff. When I first got into ministry, I had a lady that was converted through the radio program. Ben talking about the radio. She's converted through the radio program they had where I was located. Anyway, she was coming to church, and then all of a sudden, she stopped coming. And I was very young, and I didn't know what was going on. The preacher and I was a youth minister at the time, went out to visit her, and come to find out her pet had died. And she dove into really complicated grief. So much so, she quit coming to church. It affected her relationship with her husband. She lost her job. I was too young to understand, and I did not stay at that place very long, but a death of a pet can affect people. Even a child can experience grief. You think, well, silly children, I mean, they lose a toy, a stuffed animal, a blanket. No, they can experience grief. And we could say it this way, love plus loss equals grief. So if you have the ability to love, if you have the ability to express some kind of connection in love, and you have a loss there, it equals grief. And so when we think about grief, we need to realize it's real. People have real emotions, real feelings, and it doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter if you're the President of the United States or if you're a homeless person, somewhere in between. We all experience grief in this way. And so if you're old enough to love, you're old enough to mourn. Not to minimize other types of loss, but I want us to focus on the loss of a loved one. That seems to be the one thing that we have a lot of questions. We're all connected to that. That's one loss we have in common. And so I want to focus on that as we think about this. When we think about the loss of a loved one, there's a lot of emotions goes on. I've heard this expression, after everybody goes home. After everybody goes home. Well, what takes place after everybody goes home when you lose a loved one? Well, that's when reality sets in. That's when the responsibilities change. Now, I realize that people lose loved ones in a variety of ways. There's a long-term where someone is dealing with sickness, and it's a long process. There's where it happens, there's an accident, and then someone dies overnight. There's all kinds of things. But regardless of where anyone is, there is changes. When a loved one dies, there are changes, such thing as responsibility. You think about the realization that this person's not there. They may used to do the dishes, cook the food, take the trash out. Something as simple as putting up Christmas decorations, putting the family dinners together, working on a car. All these things change overnight. And so grief sets in. That contribution to the family is missing. That is along with the grief. I've even heard when everybody has gone home, resentment. There is sometimes resentment. Why didn't they take care of their health? And why didn't they listen to the doctor? Why did they have to go to the store? Maybe they were in an accident. Why did they have to do it? And it began to be resentment. That's sometimes the emotion, the feelings that go on, things that are said. But we could say this, everything changes after a person passes. Everything changes. Chores, routines. Maybe it was one of those situations where it was a doctor situation and they were on doctor's care. And so there was this routine of going every week, and that's changed. Yes, there may even be relief. I know that sounds in some ways a little morbid, but it's not uncommon. And I don't believe it's necessarily morbid, but there is sometimes, yes, resentment. Sometimes there's relief. Sometimes when people are dealing with diseases, cancers, Alzheimer's, these types of long extended illnesses, Parkinson's, whatever, where there is a process, sometimes the grief process takes a slower turn and we've learned to let go. So I've talked to one lady and she was saying her husband had dementia, Alzheimer's, and it was over, I'm going to say 5 to 10 years process. She said, I didn't cry at the funeral. I didn't cry at the funeral. And we'll talk a little bit about that later, but that's also a sign of grief. You want to think, well, you got to cry. No, that's one emotional response to death, and we all deal with it differently. And sometimes people cry, sometimes people don't. But as we think about this grief process, life goes on for the living. And they are left with these emotions, responsibilities, these types of things. And so this is where we come to this grief process, working through this process. Now, when the experiencing grief, I think Lamentations verses 1 and 12 expresses what a lot of people experience, express what many feel when it says, no passer by even cares. Why doesn't somebody notice my terrible sufferings? You been there? I can think about when my grandfather passed away. He was, I was close to him, and I can remember seeing the hearse. I was going down the road. I remember passing the hearse. They were taking him to the church building. We'd run to town, and I saw it for the first time. And I can express that, I expressed it. I remember saying in a similar way, why doesn't everybody stop? Why doesn't the people stop along the road? That's my grandfather. Why doesn't it? I mean, I just lost my grandfather, and there is a sense where this lament, as Jeremiah is true. I've experienced that. Nobody cares. See, life goes on, and yet our world stops as we think about this experience. When we think about the passing of one, our world does stop. And it feels this way. Now, with that said, all of us deal with grief different. I mentioned and kind of touched on, some of us cry, but not all of us. Some of us have resentment, but not all of us. When we think about those feelings of resentment, we sometimes are wrestling with how to deal with it. I want to think about David. I want to jump down to David for a moment. In Scripture, we have David dealing with grief. Now, every person's different, but I would also argue every person that passes in our life, we have a different response. Notice in Psalms 31 and verse 9, David's dealing with loss. And I don't believe it's talking necessarily about a loss of a person, but he's dealing with grief. And I think if I understand what the commentators are saying is that this could be either time when David was running from Saul or he's dealing with Absalom. One of those cases. But notice what Psalms 31 verse 9 says. Be gracious to me, O Lord, for I am in distress. My eye is wasted from grief. My soul and my body also. What's it sound like? He's wasted, he's crying, he's tearful, he's mourning. This isn't just a little tear. This is, you see the grief in that verse. And so there's loss. And so David is expressing in this psalm and asking the Lord's graciousness, but notice his grief affects the whole body. It affects the whole body. Someone asked, how does grief hurt? It hurts everywhere. It hurts physically, emotionally, spiritually, mentally. And we see that glimpse with David. But this is not the only time David experienced loss. In 2 Samuel 12, we see about the child. I'm assuming most of us know the background on David and Bathsheba, that experience that the Bible relays. David commits adultery with Bathsheba, and out of that, the child dies. And if you know the text, if you remember the text, we see that David mourned and fasted before that baby died. And then when the baby dies, notice what he does. While the child was still alive, I fasted and wept, for I said, who knows whether the Lord will be gracious to me, that the child may live. But how now he is dead, why should I fast? Can I bring him back again? I shall go to him, but he will not return to me. We stand back and think about that, what David did. Even the people in David's time was confused. When do you traditionally mourn? After, right? David had it backwards here. Or maybe he had it right. You know, David mourned, grieved, wept for that child. He knew, and that's another part of grief, the anticipation of grief. Knowing that you have the sickness or loved ones dying, knowing there is sometimes that anticipation. That's a different topic altogether when we think about this. But then what happened when the child did die? How did he grieve? He got cleaned up. He stopped grieving. I don't want to say stop grieving. He stopped fasting. He stopped weeping. This is the same guy that we talk about that is grieving his whole soul and body in that situation. Different situation. Then notice in 2 Samuel chapter 1, David experienced another type of grief. This is when Saul and Jonathan, just kind of interesting to me. Here is Saul. What was Saul trying to do to David towards the end of Saul's life? Try to what? Kill him. And what does David do? He grieves. He mourns. He laments. In 2 Samuel chapter 1, it is defined as a lament. It is sorrow. He is mournful of his death and Jonathan's death. So here is one person, and we see different responses in different circumstances of grief. So when we think about grief, it's not a cookie cutter. It's not something, my grandparents passed away. I experienced death. I experienced grief. Okay, so when my uncle passes away, I know how to deal with it. That's not how that works. Grief is relation to the emotional attachment to the person at the time of death. And so in David's life, we see 3 different responses, all grief, but they're different. You might experience in your life different responses to grief depending on the emotional attachment of an individual that you're dealing with, that you love, and that also plays into how they pass away. People have different emotional responses to a suicide compared to someone who is expected to die. Somebody has a long-term, who lived their life different. I'm not saying that it's going to be any easier. It's just different. And we also see this in Scripture. We know this. The Scriptures even says for the Christian has a different response to grief. In 1 Thessalonians 4 and verse 13, Paul is dealing with Christians, and they had some questions about Jesus and coming back, and they thought they were going to. They thought their dead loved ones were going to miss out on the return of Jesus, and Paul tries to give some explaining of that and comfort. But notice what he says in verse 13 of 1 Thessalonians 4. That he doesn't want to be uninformed, but those who are asleep, that you may not grieve as others do who have no hope. Notice that Paul indicates that the Christian grieves different. Notice we still grieve. We still grieve. It's different. David grieved different when those 3 instances I pointed out. you're going to grieve different. You're going to grieve different than the world if you're a Christian. You're going to grieve different in different times in your life. There's difference. So we each deal with death and loss differently, and in this case, than those who have faith. We also see that when we think about these emotions that come along with grief, there's all kinds of emotions that are connected with grief. Notice Lamentations 5, verse 14. Get it in context. Remember, Lamentations, Jeremiah, the weeping prophet, I'll talk about him on Sunday, Lord willing. But Lamentations, the weeping prophet, what's that tell you? He's dealing with grief. He's not just dealing with the grief and loss of the potential loss of people, but his city and the whole relationship with God. And that's a grief. But notice in Lamentations 5, verse 15, the joy of our hearts has ceased. Our dancing has been turned to mourning. Grief can deeply affect us. It changes our emotions. It changes our direction. And so notice as this is expressed here, it's for a season. There is a time when it affects us. Now, I want us to think about some of these emotions, because sometimes when we feel grief, we get into all different types of emotions and feelings and things. Some years ago, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross made it popular. Maybe you're familiar with this. It's very popular. These grief process is worded different things. And then Ohio State University made a list, and there's several lists out there of the grief process. Now, one of the things that's kind of been mistaken about these is when you read these lists, and like one of the first things is shock or denial, and that is certainly the case. When we hear the death of a loved one, regardless if there was anticipation or it was just totally out of the blue, there is a sense of grief or a sense of shock, a sense of, just, I can't believe it. And so that's usually the initial. But after that, the emotions vary and they bounce around. Usually what's happened, you have denial, but then there might be anger. And then I'll come back to anger here in a moment. Then there's sadness. There might be guilt. I mentioned earlier, there might be all these different feelings. Yes, there might even be a sense of relief. If there was a parent or a spouse that one had to be the caretaker, there might be a certain, and I've heard people say this, well, they're not suffering anymore. There's relief. I was talking to one gentleman, and he had lost his wife through a long process. He was her caregiver, and then he had several other relatives close to him pass away. He was suffering from deep grief. And in that conversation, he said, and there were some things that brought it up, but he said, I don't want to take care of another person. I don't want to, and what he was meaning is, I don't want to go through that process again. Sometimes we feel about that. I'm not saying that's right or not wrong. I'm just saying that's where people feel. That's some of the emotions that people. So when we experience grief, we have all these different emotions. I want to just briefly talk about anger. One of the ones that we see is anger. Anger is an emotion. We all get angry. The Bible talks about anger, to get angry and sin not. There is anger that is sinful. Road rage. You've heard of road rage? Yeah, we've heard of that. We laugh, but it's serious. What's the extreme? You've heard people getting killed. Someone following someone and pulling out their gun and shooting them when they get in their home or grocery store or something like that. Terrible things. And so when we think about anger is one of the things that happens when we are experiencing grief. There is sometimes anger towards God, and I'd like to talk about that. That's a topic in itself. Anger comes when we think we've been wronged. There is a sense that we think we've been wronged. Anger is natural. Anger is a red flag. Anger is also saying not only that we've been wrong, but there is something wrong. Why do we get angry? Well, there's something wrong. That guy who passed us and did something on the road, there's something wrong there, isn't it? He broke the speed limit. He ran a red light. There's something wrong. It might be minor in one way, but there's a trigger there where that's wrong. Needless to say, when we think about our loved ones and there's anger, there's something wrong. What's wrong? They're not there. It could be something simple. They're not here to take out the trash. They're not here to wash the dishes. It could be they did something dumb. Maybe they were driving and were looking at their cell phone, didn't have their seatbelt on and crossed the line and had an accident and they died. I'm angry about that. Why did they look at their phone? Why did they take their seatbelt? Why didn't they have their seatbelt on? These types of things. Anger. It can be angry with God. Can't God stop these things? Anger. And so anger is one of the things that we deal. The other is depression or sadness. And the way I like to tell it, we all experience sadness or depression. And I realize there's different levels of that. And I'm not a medical person. I can't diagnose that. But I can just make you aware that depression, sadness, it's kind of like a cold. How long do you have a cold? The doctor, one time I was sick and the doctor went to the doctor and he says, you have a cold? He goes, you can call me either in 2 weeks or 14 days, whatever, if you're not better. Ben got it, thanks. Colds generally last, if it lasts longer than 2 weeks or a few weeks, it's probably not a cold. And you need help. The same way, sometimes anger, sometimes sadness or depression, sometimes we can people get stuck in that. And sometimes it's something more than just routine, if I could say it that way, sickness or sadness. And sometimes people need professional help. Sometimes they might need counseling. Sometimes I know some simply dealing with depression, sometimes all they needed was a vitamin. I can't prescribe that, okay? But I'm just saying but sometimes they needed medical treatment, they needed therapy. So depending on where people are. Then there is the mental aspect, confusion, disorganization. And sometimes you ever have foggy mind, your mind's foggy? You're just like, my brain is just foggy today. Well, sometimes grief can make our minds foggy. We're confused. We're not in our routine. I was reading an article just preparing for this weekend, talking about how that is not a bad thing for our brain. It's our brain trying to reboot, in a sense. You put it in computer terms, technology. And again, I don't know all the details. I don't know how all the brain works and all that type of thing, but it makes sense to me. Our brain's trying to figure out this new reality. And sometimes we don't like that too well. And we get disorganized and we're confused and we get foggy. Sometimes physical. When you think about dealing with a loved one who passes, and I have walked that road many times, maybe you have too. There's late nights. You're doing things. You might be providing care that you are being introduced to. I've been with people that, in the hospital, nurses say, well, you can do this to help comfort your loved one. Bring pillows, bring this, bring that. You're doing something that you've never done before. It's stressful. It's, physically exhausting. You're not sleeping right. You're not getting any sleep at all. And so that plays into it. And then there's spiritual. There's a spiritual aspect. Maybe you draw closer to God. Maybe you draw away from God. Maybe you're questioning God. if I could summarize all these emotions, is that if you feel unnatural, that's natural. Does that make sense? Grief does that. It's like putting our emotions into a blender. And it's not necessarily a process. Yes, there is a process, I guess, in a sense, but the process is not a process. One person has explained it as this way: it's like lightning. It's jagged. You don't know, it's random. And so grief can be like that. Another way to explain it is like an ocean wave. This Vicki Harrison stated, grief is like the ocean. It comes on waves, ebbing and flowing. Sometimes the water is calm and sometimes it's overwhelming. All we can do is learn to swim. And that's grief. It's like lightning. It's like a wave. And so someone might say, well, how long will this last? How long will these lightning bolts? How long will this wave last? At least a year, because you've got to go through all the seasons. But it may even last longer. It might last a long lifetime. Someone says, have said something along the lines, well, the longer you know the person, the longer your grief. Well, that's not necessarily true. A lady has a miscarriage, may have grief for a long time dealing with that miscarriage. See, it's the emotional attachment of the person, or it could be a thing, a home, a car, at the time of the loss. And so each one is different. And here's another thing. As you think about grief, it can be triggered. So you go through the year, you go through all the anniversaries, you go through the birthdays, you go through all the seasons, and you might be learning to cope. But then the second year, the third year, there's an anniversary. And so there is such thing as anniversary grief. And so there are sometimes people will have the holidays. I don't know if I would have an opportunity to come back, but that'd be another seminar, workshop to go through. Holiday grief. That's a very important thing, because the holidays, as joyful as many of them are, they are not very joyful for a lot of people. Holidays. Because what happens at holidays? Family comes over, or you go to family. What if that loved one's not there for you to go over or to come to your house? What if you had a tradition where you bought things and you don't buy that for them, or a meal, or all these things that are just the way life goes, and they're not there to do that with you? And so it brings up all these emotions. And so sometimes that happens. Sometimes another thing, a very powerful sense we have is our smell. And so sometimes, and I've done this with my wife, sometimes I'll smell something, trigger a memory. Our sense of smell is a very powerful trigger for memory. And often that can start grief up. When I was a kid, I remember going to my grandparents and smelling the chestnuts. I don't know if you're familiar with the chestnut blooms, but to me, they smell like bleach, and it's not a pleasant smell. But my grandfather had chestnuts lining his driveway, and I can remember smelling that and thinking Grandpa's house. Even today, my grandfather has been passed away for, 10, maybe 15 years, 10 years. Still, when the chestnuts bloom, I think about Grandpa. Am I angry? No, it's just a memory. And I have sadness for a moment because I can't go and see him, but it's there. And so we will be triggered, smell, an event, Christmas, birthday, these types of things. There's different things that are triggers. Well, the question is, how long? Well, you'll feel better when you feel better. And we don't really feel better. It takes time to cope. And I would stress using that way. Sometimes and I'll talk about this later, but I just kind of bring it up here. Sometimes we say, well, they should be feeling better now. And I would argue and say that's probably not the best thing to say. You feel better when you feel better. You say, well, it's been a year. Well, yeah, but it might take longer than a year. It might take a lifetime. And I've not been able to do this real well, but some of the suggestions I have came across is if a minister knows the anniversaries of the congregation when a person has lost a loved one that are important to them. That's hard because I tried to know the birthdays, of the congregation, but be aware of those anniversaries of those who lost loved ones and know that that's going to be probably a bad day. And I have experienced people that have had bad days, and you're just like, what's going on? Well, nothing right. Well, if you kind of know them a little better, that's their husband's birthday. That's the day they found out he was sick, or these types of things. If you know that, you can help minister to people. And it takes time, and I've not done a very good job of that. But if you're aware of that, you can be able to help with people. When a loved one passes, we're faced with a new reality. Things won't be the same. It might be compared, we often think about grief and losing a loved one. It's kind of like an injury, a cut. And like I have a spot on my hand. I cut myself here. I actually was dragging brush the other day. It's been probably 2 months ago. Now I got a scar there. You know what a scar, it'll heal. It's not bleeding anymore. I can touch it, but there's a red mark there. There's a mark there. And that's more like what grief is. It doesn't really heal. It leaves a mark. A broken bone, for example, or other injuries. Sometimes the rain, that you can tell the rain because of your arthritis kicks. That's kind of like grief. It will show up from time to time throughout life. And so we don't really get over grief. We learn to cope. Well, we're running out of time for this session, and I just want to maybe we can bring this up in the next session, but I want to just close right now with the myths of grief. I just picked out 3 myths. Time heals all wounds. I've already kind of addressed that. That's a myth. Sometimes time doesn't heal all wounds. And when you think about grief, it's not going to heal over time. I mentioned this earlier. If I cry, I'm not strong. And I guess it's kind of for the guys. Remember this, Jesus wept. Remember this, David mourned and wept. We've already talked about that. Jeremiah was the weeping prophet. It is very natural to cry. God designed us to have tears and cry. And let me also say this, but if you don't cry, that doesn't mean that you're necessarily strange or unusual. Some people cry. Some people don't. I've talked to one person who lost a loved one, and they didn't cry. That's also there's a way to deal with grief. There might be some medical things why people don't cry, but not everybody cries. And then the last myth, if I feel sorrow or grief, I must not be trusting God. Well, I hope you can see at this point that's a myth. Because David, did he trust God? Yeah. Did Jesus trust God? Yeah. All the people in the Bible we see that dealt with grief trusted God. These are just some of the myths that are out there when we talk about grief, and we might dispel some of them as we continue on. But we're going to close right now, and when we have about 15 minutes or so? Whatever you want. Okay. Well, we'll pause here, and if you want to get a donut or restroom, we'll do that, and then we'll pick it up here. 15 minutes.